Hi, and welcome to this first in a new series of seminars, seminars that are being organized by Alameda to present and discuss working papers. We've got a new working paper series. The very first of this working paper series has been authored by Sabrina Fernandes, who is joining us today, and it's entitled Towards a Concept of Ecological Sovereignty. These events are intended to be slightly more informal in format, so that we can enable discussion, debate, and as working papers that we can work through the ideas, because they're intended to continue evolving and developing. I'm very pleased also to be joined by Raj Patel. I'll introduce both the speakers in a minute. But just to let you know that this first working paper is part of the first research stream of the After Order project, which is entitled Sovereignty Beyond Neoliberalism, and it explores changes in political economy, how they affect the exercise of sovereignty, and in particular, it considers alternatives to neoliberal capitalism that might enable just transitions. And so this first working paper is really central to the After Order project. It's also actually central to a lot of Alameda's other work on ecological transition. A few words on format. We're going to be here for about 80 to 90 minutes. First of all, Sabrina's going to present her working paper. Then Raj is going to offer a response to that. I will then pose a couple of questions to the two of them before opening up to questions from the audience. So if you have questions at that point, please write them into the Q&A. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please bear in mind that this is intended to be a space of discussion, so be respectful and constructive with all the things that you're writing in the Q&A. We welcome, of course, thoughtful, provocative, even critical perspectives on what's being discussed, but try to keep them relevant and aligned to the working paper and to the themes that are under discussion. If you have any technical difficulties, you can send a message in the chat and we'll try to help you where we can. I have some colleagues here who are going to be fielding any questions and also any queries about technical matters. Before starting then, I will just introduce Sabrina Fernandes, who is a political economist and sociologist. She's a senior leadership fellow at Alameda and has been absolutely instrumental in the development of Alameda since its launch back in 2023. She's also a scientist in residence at IDEA, which is the Institute of Advanced Studies of Unicamp, which is the State University of Campinas. She's part of the Ecosocial and Intercultural Pact of the South, a member of the editorial committee of the NACLA Report, a columnist at the Intercept Brasil, and a senior research advisor to Oxford University's Technology and Industrialisation for Development Centre, TIDE. Her research focuses on political ecology, just transitions, Latin America, and internationalism. Raj Patel then is a research professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. He's testified about food and hunger to the US, UK, and EU governments, and his books, including Stuffed and Starved, The Value of Nothing. He's also co-author of A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things and Inflamed, have been translated into dozens of languages. He's a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and co-director of the documentary The Ants and the Grasshopper. Raj is also an associate of Alameda. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Sabrina, and you'll have about 15 minutes, Sabrina, to present your working paper. If you want to put the slides on, you do that yourself, and if you have any questions while you're presenting, feel free to ask our colleagues to join. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Juliano. Thanks, Raj. Thanks, everyone that's in the attendance. We just changed the theme to talk about ecological sovereignty. Now, I was looking at the attendee list. I can recognize a few names. So thanks for showing up, because I think from the names that I'm telling here, there's some interest in actually discussing sovereignty as a concept, but also as a demand that's being articulated from many struggles right now. I think it's a bit of a buzzword It's a word that we throw around a lot in leftist circles, in particularly. In particular, we also find it a lot as well, if you're anti-imperialist, what do you stand for? You stand for sovereignty, and you kind of just throw it around, and we don't really talk about its meaning anymore. Unless you are in IR studies or if you're actually in academia. In the actual political space, the word is just a word. You're supposed to know what it means. And we just kind of assume that everybody is defending the same meaning. So we need to bring back this debate, especially because I started discussing sovereignty when I joined Alameda as a proper concept. I think it's been part of my work for a really long time. But when I joined Alameda a couple of years ago, and we decided that we wanted to have a discussion on the polycrisis, perhaps a critique of the readings of the polycrisis, the more dominant readings of the polycrisis, we thought that sovereignty would be also a good way to approach this. This ended up culminating into parts of the After Order project as well. And that was before Trump got reelected in the US. That was before all of the tariffs. That was before even some of the conversations on multipolarity became more known to people. And now we kind of have this feeling that we were on the right track here. It is important to discuss sovereignty because a lot of what was talked about in terms of, are we heading to a multipolar world? It's not really playing as out as I assume people were hoping for. Was some of the conversations connected to how the BRICS bloc has been organized are not necessarily the way that a lot of people on the left were hoping for. I think there was a little bit of a wishful thinking that BRICS would become a very strong political opposition force and not so much what we see in terms of economic development, economic agreements, cooperation and sharing like that. So all of this debate played out in a dossier that we had a couple of years ago at Alameda on internationalism. Then we decided we wanted to move into food sovereignty, and Raj took part in that dossier as well. And then we ended up having two very interesting oppositional debates here. One is, in terms of the international world order, our expectations for a new type of sovereignty through the states, through state agreements, through new blocks, through perhaps a rearrangement around multilateral institutions, was it actually heading into a new type of sovereignty? Or should we look at social movements? Should we look at these other articulations in the global south that perhaps engage with BRICS, that perhaps engage with other types of multilateral arrangements like UNASUR, but are also really focused on talking about private property and common property, how we rearrange production as a way of dealing with sovereignty. So all of this was kind of in the background and was motivating me to dig into this a little deeper. Alongside this, is like a worry that I had in general, that we were approaching the polycrisis from a global north, US-centric, Eurocentric perspective, especially when we were discussing polycrisis and the invasion of Ukraine. This ended up being one of the central points. A lot of people are talking pandemics, like three major events of the polycrisis: climate change in the background, and then you had the invasion of Ukraine, and then you had the pandemics, and it showed how the whole world was very interconnected, and that was interrupting a lot of flows of goods and services. The invasion of Ukraine, what that meant for food prices, for example, what that meant for the energy crisis in Europe, what that meant for the cost of living crisis, whereas in the global south, crisis is almost like everyday life. It's not just when you have a bubble bursting or because, inflation is through the roof at this particular time, or you had a coup. Coups are things that, we, in our lifetime, we were very used to it, unfortunately, and even in the 21st century, right? So these things kind of shock us, but we have been built to expect them anyway. So looking into the polycrisis from the margins, from the global south perspective, is also a way for us to bring into other matters, other variables, other events, and say, well, there are other crises in the background, and there are other places that we should be looking at. And I started researching sacrifice zones as something that I thought was very important to deal with the just transition. Understanding the hegemonic transition debate, we know that this is not transition at all. It is about corporate grabs. It is about diversifying portfolios. It is about making sure that you can adapt the current stage of capitalism to survive a little longer. It's not even about preventing the collapse of capitalism. It is about extending the lifespan of capitalism, making sure that you're decarbonizing and you're trying to promote some level of coexistence between green capital and fossil capital. The way green capital came along is not necessarily to make sure fossil capital is obsolete, but they actually are operating inside the same company. So we had these stages where Total Energies did this huge rebranding, these stages of a lot of the oil companies going to the UNFCCC and say, oh no, we are decarbonizing our operations. Many times they were doing this through very specific geoengineering or technological, this technical optimism approach, that we're doing carbon capture storage, or we're doing carbon markets, and that's the way that we're going to approach or perhaps solve the climate crisis. So a lot of the false solutions were there, but even in the just transition debate, there was a lack of connections when it came to the whole of the impact chain and approaching planetary boundaries in a more holistic capacity. So I'm trying to show here the trajectory, why talking about ecological sovereignty became something important, and before this working paper came along. With the just transition debate, of course, we have progressive voices, working class voices, we have social movements, because just transition was born in that space, making sure that jobs that would be lost due to decarbonization, to deactivating of thermal coal power plants or coal mining and things like that, these people will have a proper just destination. They wouldn't just be thrown into poverty. However, with time, we find that this became kind of centralized in making sure that you're just moving people along within the capitalist chain. So if capital adapted from combustion engines to electrical engines, then we're just going to channel workers in that direction. We saw this very, very often with the auto worker industry. And this influenced a lot of the auto worker unions as well, rightly so, because they are concerned with their economic livelihoods. But this larger debate on impacts on extractivism and mining in general, on even the model of society, like, do we need a society forever that's so focused on cars and not so much other types of mobility, cities that will be safer, other modes of transportation? Everything ended up being captured in the EV route. And it's no surprise that the EV route is also connected with big tech, is also connected with big mining, is also connected with some of the worst billionaires that we have running the planet right now. So that required that we had more of an internationalist lens to try to track this impact and to try to build alliances that would understand that a just transition can be just a just transition in a specific sector or in a specific country. We need to be able to look at the places of impact and find some more useful links with people. And this is no longer, it is no longer acceptable to say that workers are one thing and the marginalized communities or the impacted communities, they're another thing, and then they should just work together. There's too much overlap here. So the work of Martina Arboleda was very important for me on Planetary Mind, talking about the workers' body as a sacrifice zone as well. And from this, I understood that we had to better articulate some of these debates around sovereignty, especially because coming from the global south, from Brazil, being an activist myself, and understanding that in a lot of these spaces, sovereignty was being articulated as this be-all, end-all demand, anti-imperialist demand that was not properly discussed. We were actually normalizing sacrifice zones as body, as territory, and leaving matters of production unquestioned just because sovereignty was understood as control. Control of the territory, control of the industry, control of the input and the output, but not really questioning the technologies, not really questioning why we're producing what we're producing. So we found that, for example, in the case of fossil fuels, a lot of the debates for a just transition and for gradual approaches so that global south countries that were considered and are considered underdeveloped could finally have an approach to development through fossil fuel extraction, having a little bit more time and making sure that the countries in the global north, they will be responsible for bringing about the transition a little faster to buy this time. A lot of this was also based on scientific denialism of how much time we have. And a lot of these were kind of normalizing what we were considering from as development from before. So does development, do we have to go through the stage of getting money from fossil fuels first and then we transition? Or could we actually speed up this process and skip it all the way by having another perspective on the territory and what we want to produce? That led me to discuss a lot of things around mining. So in this working paper, it's something that I have some cases, for example, discussing the Panama situation, the discourse on sovereignty that was common in Brazil starting last year on the Trump-Lula debate over there. But in general, just kind of understanding that we should compare the way we've been doing these things right now to perhaps other ways of using an articulation of sovereignty to go even further, to improve our critique of the polycrisis, to improve how we're articulating transitions in a more international capacity, which brings me just to two tables that I used in the working paper. So those of you who registered before and got access to it, this is already familiar to you. It's nothing new. But I just wanted to highlight the sort of scheme that I organized in my head. Like Juliano highlighted, the working paper is a work in progress. This is the reason why Alameda developed the series, so we could refine the debate before it turns into something else. But I understood that because we are kind of trapped in this Westphalian notion of sovereignty from the 17th century, where, well, we have the state. The state is a trinity, is a state connected to a specific version of a nation and a specific version of wealth and property that evolved into modern capitalism. So we talk about the nation-state capital trinity here, and that ended up preventing us from challenging what is meant by the national interest. And because the national interest is so connected to this alliance with corporate and capitalist interests, sometimes popular interests end up subordinated too. So sovereignty ended up being understood as something that you mobilize and you say that it's because of the national interest, but this national interest is in a state of subsumption related to the corporate capitalist class interest. We see this a lot with agribusiness in Brazil. I think this is a big example. You cannot do anything that would actually hurt agribusiness because agribusiness is a huge part of our GDP, and that's up for debate. How much is actually agribusiness and how much is all of the other sectors that have come to rely on agribusiness. And you exercise this national state sovereignty to take part in this national and global capitalist hegemony. So integration becomes a conversation of integration into capitalism and not necessarily regional integration to build something else. And this is why I brought the BRICS debate here, because this is the big question. What BRICS can bring in terms of novelty and exist as opposition and perhaps some breathing space against the standard of US-centric capitalism, but where BRICS is completely limited through a conversation of economic integration that's still playing by the same rules, through limitless growth, capitalist expansion, or capitalist expansion with some social control, but we're still not discussing the metabolic rifts, and we're failing to address the planetary polycrisis within the planetary boundaries. And as an alternative, perhaps understanding these contradictions, we could move into a different framework where our agency is based on workers and territorialized peoples and ecosystems, and our result is more internationalist cooperation and not international cooperation. So the meaning of internationalism is important. I think we can bring this up during the debate, hash this out a little bit further. But in terms of ideology, what are we answering to? We have metabolic material conditions that shape our reality. And there's something about the Marxist approach that sometimes gets left behind, that when Marx was talking there in the Brumaire of the conditions, we make our own history, but not under conditions of our own choosing. These conditions are not just the correlation of forces between the working class and the bourgeoisie. These are also ecological conditions. They are inherited, and we're also shaping them. So bringing this to the core and making sure that it's not a secondary element would be very important. So if we're producing sovereignty through workers and territorialized peoples and ecosystems, and having the metabolic material conditions in place, so metabolic material are our political conditions and our ecological conditions, we can aspire towards ecological sovereignty and have an objective. This is the telos here, an objective of abundance within means. So it's not this empty notion of economic prosperity or green prosperity that has become kind of another buzz term that we have on the left, that, oh, we're building green prosperity because now it's going to be actualized with nature, but it's normalizing fossil solutions too. It's normalizing carbon markets and all their impacts and things like that. But no, talking about abundance within means as a way of troubling this idea that prosperity needs to be prosperity within the planetary boundaries, working through resilience and immunity, not as resilience to shocks, as a way that, the World Economic Forum approaches the polycrisis. It's just, having more diversity in the portfolios and the investments, so we're more immune to the shocks. But actually something that has to do, that I learn a lot from agroecology, where your diversity, your planning, and even things that you don't necessarily control, those are important to make sure that you move it along. So this planetary resilience would be a lot more related to making sure that we're not having a homogeneous form of production, but production that's more connected to the different ecosystems, more connected to the different ways of life, and trying to make them compatible rather than imposing the imperial mode of living, as coming from Ulrich Brand and Marcus Wies and their conversation here, as the standard. And we find that a lot of what's being sold as green prosperity right now is based on a green imperial mode of living, because we're afraid to work with people and say that we're being ideologically manipulated or inclined to think of prosperity in a way that is still very much based on the same capitalist ideal of production and consumption. And that will lead us to discuss good life, social emancipation, radical sustainability. So this is the general framework. I can't get into much. I already went over my time, but we can debate this. And a lot of this is already exposed. And, I know what this, it ended up like in 7,000 words, right, Juliano? So there's a lot of case studies that I do there, a lot of data to try to bring some elements and examples into this.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sabrina. I'm going to pass straight over to Raj. to offer a response, and afterwards I'll pose a few questions to the two of you.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for showing up. Thank you, Sabrina, for writing such a fantastic paper. And thank you everyone from the Alameda Institute, Juliano, Becca, Ben, and Zara for making this all happen. Now, I am going to try and do a couple of things. First of all, as a celebrant of this paper, I just want to maybe add something that despite the 7,000 words, there wasn't space for, which is to show how capitalism is a world-making project. And that's important because if we're going to dig into thinking about what ecological sovereignty might mean, it's important to understand the sort of the terrain that's been left for us by by late capitalism and the remains of neoliberalism. So I'm really excited about this paper and where it's leading us. And what I want to do, I guess, is just sort of talk briefly about how we need to be thinking about territorial sovereignty and thinking about world ecology in general. So the first thing I want to point out, and I'm just going to sort of run through some things here. When Sabrina was pointing out the metabolic rift, it's important to understand that this isn't some accident of capitalism. The rift is the metabolic rift is the way that capitalism survives. And again, I know many folk on the call today will be familiar with these two gentlemen, but just in case you're not, Justus von Liebig there on the left was the guy who pointed out that the fields in Europe were becoming increasingly denuded of nutrients because of the ways that food was being taken from rural areas, consumed in urban areas, and then the nutrients were being flushed away, sent out into the streams, and not replenishing the basis for the food production that allowed the Industrial Revolution to go ahead. Marx understood that rather well and understood the political processes that generated that metabolic rift and showed how it is integral to the way that capitalism functions. And that process is worth thinking through when we think about the metabolic rift and the world that it created. So let me show you a picture of two different animals. Here on the left, the Pacific anchovy, and on the right, the cormorant that eats this Pacific anchovy. Now, the reason that these two are world historically important is because of the process through which the anchovy ends up in the fields of Europe. The anchovy is rich in nutrients. The birds eat it and shit it out and create huge pillars of fertilizer. That fertilizer is brought over, what was brought over to Europe and used, and not just in Europe, but used in the United States as well, to replace the nutrients that have been denuded by the hunger of European cities and the need to feed the proletariat. Now, what that does is create a world of a certain kind of this process of imperialism demands its own kinds of ecological sovereignty, and it creates new kinds of worlds. So in Peru, where which was the center of the guano trade, you had not just capital flowing from Europe. I mean, the reason that the guano trade exists is because the British had loaned the Peruvians money to be able to fight a war against the Spanish, and the Peruvians repaid that in guano. But in order to have that guano, you needed labor. The labor was brought over from China, and the world that was created through these laborers, and you see the laborers sort of chipping away at these huge piles of bird crap. But what that meant was a regime of labor migration that itself ended up being important not just for Peru, but for, in fact, the United States, which in the end was very concerned about the flows of migrant labor from China, and was very worried that this would become a way in which Southern planters in the United States would find extra labor, and there was such concern that the U.S. immigration system was invented to be able to police the flow of migrant laborers from China into the United States. So when we're thinking about the modern, when we're thinking about the modern nation state, actually, the first consular interview from the United States was invented in order to police the bodies of migrants flowing from China through Peru, possibly into the United States. And so now, we're all very worried about coming to the US and being sort of grilled by ICE. The origins of that lay in the nation building and the world making that comes from policing the metabolic rift, which itself was part of capitalism's ecology. So that's the first point. I just want to, again, remind us that there is an engine at play here that generates the world ecology in which we find ourselves today. And that engine is old. So then the next question is, all right, well, that's all very 19th century. What does that matter now when we're thinking about the end of neoliberalism? And this is the second point that I want to make very briefly. I'm going to sort of fly through this just as I did the other one. But I want to use here and encourage people to read or reread the work of Giovanni Arrighi in the long 20th century, and the work that he did both with Beverly Silver and with Jason W. Moore in thinking through the sort of processes through which capitalism internalizes and encompasses and engulfs its the sort of costs to capitalist expansion and the systemic cycles of accumulation. So again, this ought to be familiar, and if it isn't, we can talk about it in questions. But I mean, capitalism is both a system that doesn't like to pay its bills, but therefore a system that is always prone to crisis. And if you look at the sort of origins of territorial capitalism, and again, this is a point that I want to make, and I'm going to do that by staring at you. I mean, the whole point of capitalism. I mean, they've always been capitalists, centuries. They've been capitalists all over the place. The Silk Road filled with capitalists. What's interesting about this moment is that capitalism is a territorial enterprise, really from the beginning of the Genoese systemic cycle of accumulation. I think this is the important part again to remember, is that when we're territorializing capitalism, we're entering a sort of new phase of regulation and world building. And the Genoese cycle of systemic cycle of accumulation itself was prone to crisis. And the next part of the sort of signal crisis of Genoese capitalism led to an interregnum and then a Dutch wave of systemic accumulation, again, where the Dutch merchants went out, they accumulated as best they could, they reached a moment of crisis, their bankers took over, and the Dutch Empire ceded to an interregnum that then led to an opening that the British were able to exploit, and similarly to the US. And now we're in this moment of past a signal crisis that happened in the 60s and 70s in the US into what very much feels like a terminal crisis of US capitalism. Now, these cycles of accumulation internalized costs, and so the Genoese weren't terribly concerned with the sort of costs of protecting their mode of capital accumulation. The Dutch brought in the idea of the military. The British were very much were keen also to internalize the process of production, and the US have managed now to with the rise of the dollar to be able to police also the modes of transaction. Importantly, of course, and Sabrina's paper is so important here, what's always missing is the ecological costs. And of course, we do need to talk about social reproduction. We need to talk about gender. We need to talk about the sort of eco-feminist implications of these systemic cycles of accumulation. And so when we think about planetary boundaries, obviously we're thinking about the sort of almost Malthusian rhetoric around planetary boundaries, but we are also thinking beyond that of the process of social reproduction that capitalism always depends on, and which is buckling under the strain of neoliberalism. And what comes next is going to be a little terrifying, I think. We are in this moment of, if we're thinking about what follows neoliberalism, Um, the idea of ecological sovereignty invites this sort of question about territory. And at the beginning, I began with thinking not of ecological sovereignty, but of territorial sovereignty. And I think that's a useful friction here as we think about the geography of ecological sovereignty. What is the space that we are now being invited to consider if we're thinking, as Sabrina has invited us to do, that what we're coming to the end of is not just a US cycle of systemic accumulation, a systemic cycle of US accumulation, rather, but also the end of the Westphalian system. If we're thinking about what's coming apart at the seams here as not just a moment of sort of US hegemony descending into another interregnum and waiting weirdly for China to sort of fill this space. But if we're thinking about this as an opportunity for something radically different, then what's the geography of ecological sovereignty that we're excited about? And I offer this not as a sort of something that if we answer it, we're automatically led to utopia. Here in the United States, for example, we have the rise of the far right embracing ecofascism. And we see the rise of ecofascism everywhere. The far right have answers to the climate crisis that involve police, that involve xenophobia, that involve white supremacy and Christian nationalism, and a certain idea of territoriality and of the policing of supply chains. The French have just come out with their ideas about what food sovereignty should be like. And food sovereignty, this beautiful concept that emerges from La Via Campesina's ideas in the 1990s around democratizing the food system, have been weaponized, literally, under the French to become a way in which the French are committing themselves to militarizing supply chains so that the French will always have their coffee and their cigarettes and their chocolate. The sort of militarizing of supply chains is a kind of territorial ecological sovereignty, but it's militarized. And what the invitation is for us now is to think through what that might look like differently. So maybe I'll stop here at the end of my 15 minutes, but end with a celebration of what Sabrina's doing here. Because by bringing in this idea of ecological sovereignty, it's opening up a set of questions around what remains for us to be able to organize with after not just neoliberalism, but 5 centuries of Westphalian capitalism. If what the real question here is not, is China going to come in next? But in the interregnum after the failure of US, in the long decline of US hegemony, what resources do we have not to be able to lean back on new configurations of nation states, but precisely as Sabrina says, to crack open the idea of what these internationalisms might look like, and to draw on the sort of plurinational ideas that already exist, that we're finding in more porous ideas of the nation state that come from indigenous scholars, that come from particularly Kurdish scholars. I've been reading a lot of Öcalan recently, thinking through, well, all right, if we move away from the nation state, but thinking really actively about diaspora, thinking about shack dweller communities, thinking about the more porous boundaries of territorial ecological sovereignty that already exist and already are there to be organized through. What does the future of these new internationalisms look like? I'm really excited, Sabrina, for you to think more explicitly about that now, and really honored again just to be able to respond to this wonderful paper.
Thanks so much, Raj. So there's more than a couple of questions there, Sabrina, that you might like to pick up on. But I mean, I suppose in particular, the one about territorial connections and the necessary or even desirable geography of ecological sovereignty, as well as the last one about internationalisms. I'll pose a question of my own that you can both answer. Starting, Sabrina, you can go first, and then Raj. So the nation state presents a dilemma for the contemporary left. That is the old two-stage strategy whereby we take over the state and then we transform everything, we transform society. That hasn't historically turned out quite as planned. And at the same time, working autonomously or beyond or besides the state often leads to smaller scale, localized projects that are difficult to scale up without some mediation by or through the state. And the concept of sovereignty invites us to think, even if we are challenging the state-centric conceptualization of sovereignty, it invites us to do something which other political concepts often don't do, which is thinking necessarily about the international realm in connection with social formation. That is, sovereignty, if it's exercised by the state, let's say, outwards with a defensive posture, it also necessarily requires the exercise of certain powers internally by the state. I think that's of relevance to developing a political concept of ecological sovereignty. And so my question to you both, starting with Sabrina, is what does ecological sovereignty say to us about the dilemma or even the problem of the contemporary state?
Great questions. I took a lot of notes, so let's see if I can organize. First, I wanted to thank Raj for giving some of the background on the metabolic rift, because this is a paper and an inquiry very much informed by ecological Marxism. So I don't think that I would ever get into this dilemma, considering this a big problem, if I wasn't such a big fan of the work that Marx did, building so transdisciplinary, building from geography, geology, biology, chemistry, and everything to that to understand this relationship with the metabolism. And I would think I will go to the other part of the work that he did there, even though it was underdeveloped at the time. And this is our task. Our task is to develop this properly, which was the question of the social regulation between our metabolism and nature, which was the whole thing that he talked about, the realm of freedom later on. And I think this is our key question here. Can we live, when I talk about abundance within means, is about trying to solve the metabolic rift. It is not about eliminating impact, which is very important for us not to move into this naive version of a utopia where there's no impact on Earth. We are 8 billion people. We're going to be a couple of billion more before we stabilize, if we survive as humanity, a few more decades. And we want to ensure that this can be a planet for 10 billion people or so, living justly and living in a more emancipatory and equal way. And to do that, we're going to have to make adjustments, and that will be the social regulation. And I think a lot of our challenges here is that whenever we talk about liberating workers or a society that could be socialist or eco-socialist, we are not really thinking of the closed space that is the Earth. It is a closed system. Energy goes back and forth, right? But not other materials. And we have the second law of thermodynamics. That should be one of our bases here, right? We need to talk about entropy. We are in a very entropic system. Entropy, I think one of the biggest examples that we have entropy is plastics. We cannot really do away. Well, what we're living with the situation of microplastics is a reality. It is absolutely everywhere. It's in my clothes right now. It's like everywhere that I look, plastics are everywhere. And plastics do represent a lot of what we see in terms of the ultimate metabolic rift, and perhaps other types of ultimate metabolic rifts we could find in geoengineering and things that would trouble a lot of systems in ways that we cannot predict, right? And because of this, and bringing what Raj discussed about, I think that the question of the geography of ecological sovereignty is a key question that I don't have a proper answer to yet. It's something that's kind of been troubling me, because a lot of people say, like, so are you talking about bioregionalism? And I don't think I am. I don't think I'm saying that, oh, we're gonna get like the Amazon is this ecosystem, and this other forest in the Appalachians in the US, or the Alps and the Savannah. Is because these ecosystems are not closed spaces in itself. They're also connected to the other ecosystems that could be contiguous, and that being connected through the supply chains. Well, you showed about the guano trade and the metabolic rate from the guano trade. That was, some of the main concern for Marx in the past. And that was very important for the debate on ecological imperialism too later on, is precisely that. You cannot have ecosystems that are in one specific region as if they were bound to each other because people were mobile. Trade is the essence of mobility. And we're not going to be locking people into spaces and say that, well, you can only live within what exists here and live, let other people, they're being plagued by collapse, ecocide, or because they were born in areas where they're not as biodiverse as my country, they're going to be denied other things. We are going to have this exchange, but this exchange happens within a closed space. So I think that one of our challenges here is understanding maybe the geography of ecological sovereignty first, regarding what it is not, before we get to what it could be. And I think that a main principle for this geography should be the rejection of the idea of permanent and continuous externalization, which is at the core of the capitalist political economy. The capitalist political economy, all of the orthodox economists, my colleagues in this area, they're all based on, like, if it doesn't fit within this model, throw it out. Somebody else's problem. I always think of the beginning, like one of the Zygmunt Bauman's book, where he tells this anecdote when he's talking about, garbage, right? And there's somebody who's interviewing one of the big corporate leaders of Ford, and Ford is talking about, we have this new car next year, and then this other car that we're developing. And then the question was, so what happens to all of the old cars? It's like, oh, that's like a technical problem. Like somebody else will deal with it, right? And usually you export the problem somewhere else. So externalization happens both ways, at the point of production, impact, extraction, but also what we do later on with consumption. So challenging this relationship to show this is not separate binary. Production happens and then there's consumption. They're producing each other and reproducing. And this is our standpoint, I think, is a good way of starting to get into this conversation. So maybe Raj can tell me what he thinks about this. The geography of ecological sovereignty is not a particular space, it's a relationship. Can we think of geography as a relationship? So if we're talking about one, ecological sovereignty would not be just Peru or Europe, would be that relationship that happened there, where something was taken and not given back, and a system that was being auto-replenished through the natural processes stops being auto-replenished, and you even create a problem somewhere else, right? That would require us to have a completely different approach to trade and industrial policy, like from the get-go, which is not what I find in a lot of industrial policy spaces and debates that I take part in, including in green industrial policy. So to give another example, I've been studying a lot the Indonesian case on the development of nickel batteries in Indonesia. And it's usually treated as this amazing situation where Indonesia is finally fighting an equal economic exchange, because rather than just extracting raw nickel, it's developing at home. So there's processing plants and these future battery plants for nickel over there. But the nickel, even if becomes a battery in Indonesia, is still going to be exported somewhere else to, mostly to Europe, where the cars, the more advanced, luxurious cars for specific types of performance would require these nickel phosphate batteries. They're different from the lithium batteries that are used in the more economic cars. They're being produced in China and then exported to Indonesia, and they make up the majority of the EVs that Indonesians are buying. So we're finding here that when I'm considering the sacrifice zone of nickel mining in Indonesia, of the coal mining that's necessary, because a lot of the nickel processing is relying on coal thermal plants up until today, need to trouble this idea that things are happening just in one place. They're happening everywhere at the same time. And this is why our challenge is really big here. I think we need to start from outside and say, well, if I'm trying to build ecological sovereignty, I need to follow nickel throughout the supply chain. So can the supply chain be a geography? I think that would be my question back to Raj. Is it possible to think of the geography internationally through the connection, through the relationship, and not just the territory as one particularly bound space, because ecology cannot be bound unless we're talking about the whole Earth system here. And then we're talking about planetary boundaries. This is why me toying around with this concept is a really complicated thing in my head, because I keep building into more linkages. I did an exercise for the book that I submitted to the publisher last month. And my exercise was like, okay, let me pick 42 variables, because I cannot just deal with everything. And let's try to find some connections in terms of scales. And it got to a point that it seemed like I myself ran into a wall, because I could always dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think this is what happens when we're talking about complex systems theories, but also other approaches to the polycrisis. That will be more ecological. There are so many scales when we're talking about nature. But there are also many different scales when we're talking about human relationships, and production is precisely that. So for me, if we're talking about ecological sovereignty, we could not talk about the way that the French appropriating food sovereignty in that way, because that would be kind of what our good friend who actually introduced us, Daniel Deneco, and was telling me about eco-apartheid, which tends to be the tendency, right? Tends to be the tendency, which tends to be the case here, right? That their sovereignty becomes, once again, about me controlling the supply chain, and not me working like I am working with others that are in the supply chain to ensure that we're trying to fix metabolic rifts throughout the process, to ensure that it happens for me and happens for you. And if it means less for me of something, it is because it's more for you of that something, and we can kind of balance things out. So looking through the supply chain would be perhaps a lens of trying to dig within this geography here. And I think rejecting the idea of externalization is the main point. If we assume externalization is always someone else's problem, we're also normalizing sacrifice zones all of the time. And I think rather than approaching from this naive thinking that we're just going to eliminate impact, we need to have agreed impact that does not lead in too much of an entropic situation, where we're having more circular thinking and planning around here, and where sovereignty is articulated through the basic needs of people everywhere. I would call what you mentioned here, Raj, just another refurbished approach to food security, where my security means more than yours, and my security is more luxurious than yours. So it all comes back to the imperial mode of living. And if it means that we are again dealing with this space between the mode of production and the mode of living, which is not currently compatible with abundance within means and longevity, which is my main point behind sovereignty. None of the sovereignty that we see here has anything to do with longevity, because it always assumes that if I screw up in one place, I can take more from some other place, or I can use the tools at my disposal, my powerful tools, military tools, technological tools, capitalist tools in general, to go grab it somewhere else. So we are always expanding these frontiers, but the frontiers are inside this closed space. At some point, we're going to run out of the frontiers, and that's why now they're looking to, ocean floor mining. Where are we going to find new frontiers? Or these very naive eco-modernists talking about, we're just going to start mining meteors or things like that, right? We can always have this big imagination that technology is going to find a new frontier for us, but the externality is still there of the impact, because we're always going to sacrifice some other territory, some other people. So this is not a proper direct answer, but this is something that I'm trying to toy with, and I think your question is very important for it. And I think Juliano bringing the point of the state and the scale, and I think this is something that prior to this working paper, I wrote a book chapter for a book edited by Dina Freeman at Shanghai University. Just came out kind of like as a coincidence, but I wrote way before, which was more on the question of the left, internationalism, and sovereignty. And one of the things that I got questioned a lot, throughout the process, but is this an anarchic approach? Are you saying the state, like you're criticizing state sovereignty? So it's about doing away with the state. I'm like, I don't think this is a simple question. Because you cannot just wish the state away. But we need to be more honest about how contaminated the state arena is. It is an arena that is self-serving. The state will not abolish itself. The state will not reform itself. So shouldn't we have a very like a strategy that is both building outside and within the state, knowing the limitations of the state and being more honest about these limitations, not treating every victory that we have within the state as something that, okay, the state is saved. I don't think as long as capitalism is around, the state could be saved. And the state does have a tendency, not, I wouldn't say centralization per se, but a tendency of homogenizing things, production, consumption, identity, that cannot be solved even if you go beyond capital. So I am a communist in that sense. I do think that there's a problem right there. But right now, the state could be a tool that we could use very strategically in terms of protection, and even in terms of tricking the state of doing things for us that the state may think could be useful for the state. And in terms of the multilateral space, there are a few things that we can do there. And in terms of industrial policy, there are things we could be doing there. The state loves industrial policy because it is a pathway for accumulation, for articulating unlimited growth. So the capitalist state will be up for it. But what if we were actually toying and with industrial policy to fulfill certain needs, but also reduce sacrifice zones at the same time, by making sure our cooperation is not just tending towards unlimited growth, but our cooperation is organized towards connecting these many needs. So one of the things that is not in this paper, but I'm working on some things on the role of induction stoves, induction cooktops in industrial policy, because they are good for health reasons. They are good for decarbonizing. They're more efficient for cooking. They could help us talk about industrial policy from a gendered perspective and a care work perspective, bringing back to something that people feel could be palpable, and they could help improve the livelihoods of millions of people who are currently dependent on fossil gas, or even worse, on wood and other types of unsafe fuel. There's so many things we could be doing around that, but it's so overlooked because it looks small. It looks small to the people in industrial policy, because people in industrial policy want to build big platforms and they want to build bridges, and they want to build roads and railways, and talk about these big contracts for solar panels. But if we bring this to a scale that might look local, because I'm talking about my kitchen right now, I'm talking about something that is very local, but I think it's completely scalable. And it can be scalable by working with people, by creating subsidies, by generating new industries, by getting to conversations. And what if the community kitchens of the homeless workers movement in Brazil could be our starting point for induction stovetops. And then from that, we were teaching people how to use them. And then we're also introducing them to better pots and pans that will last longer because they are, you're not, exposing them to direct flames all of the time. They will last longer. We will be reducing some of this impact, and we won't have this necessity to create a new market all of the time. So we're actually reorganizing the economy towards stability and not organizing the economy always towards unlimited growth. But we are creating growth in the meantime. So that's where it troubles certain things, and it helps us think that the growth can be a useful orientation, and it does not have to be treated as something that could lead into austerity or this like principle that we're just going to be reducing things. No, we are creating a lot of growth, but it's growth aimed at stability, growth aimed at reaching a point where we won't need that one thing anymore. And I think we could have something like that. And we will be requiring the state, we'll be tricking the state, because the state might love it. There's a new industry there, there's some growth in the meantime, but in the long run, I think we're going to win. Because in the long run, we achieve longevity, stability, and some level of abundance with a direct improvement for people's lives, for the people who are producing things and for the people who are consuming things. And when it comes to food, and that's why I think the Via Campesina debate on food sovereignty is so important, everybody who works also eats. So we're making sure that we're not displacing as if we're separate bodies. We're not a worker for 8 hours and then we're a consumer for the other hours of the day. Everything is working at the same time over here. So I think this exercise, Juliano, is something that becomes clear when we find focal points and we draw out these connections and we show that these things are scaled through the supply chain. I'm going to keep coming back to the supply chain because I think this is where we need to make an intervention. Our intervention cannot just be in terms of new agreements or new manifestos, and we want to be sovereign in other ways. We need to intervene into how we're producing things throughout the supply chain and fixing the metabolic rifts throughout it. It's not about some supply chains should be eliminated, I think, for, nuclear bombs, weapons, but for the other supply chains, we need some level of control. I need to make sure that all of these rare earth minerals that they're promising to big corporations, not just about industrializing them at home in Brazil. If I want to avoid the sacrifice zones in the state of Minas Gerais here, I need to say there's a limit, there's a cap on how much you can mine. And this cap is about the safety of people. It's also about not collapsing the entire systems, through byproducts like uranium. There are radioactive byproducts here. So if I'm putting a cap, this cap means that maybe I should not be producing rare earth minerals for super magnets that are going to go into missiles. Maybe just for the wind turbines.
Thanks, Sabrina. Right.
Thank you. So much to get through and such little time. But to get to Juliano's question, which I think Sabrina, you and I agree on. I mean, being in and against the state is clearly the strategy here. That the state is a suspect form, particularly the neoliberal nation state. Though, again, there are really interesting subnational states, and when we look at plurinational states, there are some really interesting sort of layers in which we can find democracy without some of the more toxic elements of the state. When I think about, I really love the idea of thinking of the supply chain as happening not in just one place, but everywhere. The corollary of that is that it doesn't happen in just one time, and these supply chains have a history. And one of the ideas that I do think is quite important, alongside the rhetorics of degrowth, is the idea of reparation. we don't find ourselves in the world looking as it does by magic. There have been long series of exploitations and a great deal of debt incurred. And I think maybe that's the word that's been missing from our conversation so far, that I would urge us to think through. I mean, again, when I was pointing out the sort of cycle through which the guano moves from Peru into Europe, the engine for that was debt, right? Military debt, but nonetheless debt. When we're thinking about debt in an ecological way, the invitation is for reparation, for thinking about what a reparation ecology might look like, so that it's not just the case that the global south is condemned to grow bananas and cocoa, and that's what the supply chain is going to look like, because obviously everyone in the global north must have their coffee and cocoa. There does need to be a renegotiation around that, and I think that process of renegotiation is one where Via Campesina is currently stuck. I think that there's a really interesting set of questions around, well, look, it's all well and good for there to be really rich ideas about agroecological transition in the global north and agroecological transition, for example, in India, where in Andhra Pradesh, the state is both providing certain kinds of things and also the enemy when it comes to the transformation of the food system. But if we think about these things, then I think the idea of reparation has to sit alongside these questions of sovereignty and sit alongside, as you say, Sabrina, the shift away from yet more private property as we shift into much more public property. So we're not mining rare earths so that everyone can drive their Porsche electric car everywhere. This is mining for electric buses rather than mining for individual transportation, and that gets to one of the questions in the Q&A, which is around how cities make this work. Because we have an imagination of cities with their hinterlands that can be in many ways global. I think part of the invitation when we're thinking in and against the state is also to think about what a reconfigured ecological sovereignty might look like for a reterritorialized city. I mean, the cities at the moment are fairly bleak places when we're thinking about both the actual exercise of democracy and the sort of the global footprints that cities have. Cities that are much more, certainly food self-sufficient, are both imaginable and increasingly necessary as as the climate crisis gets worse and supply chains, these global supply chains show themselves as being far more vulnerable than we imagine them to be. Actually, it makes much more sense to have localized and regionalized food systems. So when I think about food, I do tend to think about sort of food sheds and not think about sort of these globalized supply chains. But the corollary of that is, yes, can I imagine my life without coffee and chocolate? I don't like to, but I can imagine a life without that. And your challenge, Sabrina, of thinking about nickel is a much more germane one, because that actually is something where I can't run away from that question in a way that I can when I think about food systems. But when I do think about nickel, I am thinking about what then is this relation? You're inviting me to say, well, okay, look, since we need a global geography for these nickel supply chains, is the relationality enough? And I worry about that if we don't think about debt. I worry about the sort of double-headed arrow here between places that get the nickel and the places from which it is extracted, when historically the negotiating power of the place of these sacrifice zones has been obviously much less. That's why they're sacrifice zones. And I wonder about the sort of democratic infrastructure that we need for ecological sovereignty to work at that scale. One of the invitations in the Q&A is to think about what those legal structures might be. I mean, when we think about sovereignty, we are invoking legal structures one way or another, legal structures that are governed by the state. What does it mean then for a usually indigenous area in which these rare earth metals have been found to negotiate as a peer with the cities and the industrial policy writers who tend to be far removed from those places, but who nonetheless would quite like what is under the ground of this indigenous community that nominally has sovereignty over its territory. What does it then? What are the legal structures there that your invitation to think about relation look like? And I don't know what the answer is because, as I say, with food I have better answers, but with nickel I'm stumped a little bit more, and I want more. I guess I want more clarity as we muddle through what these relations might look like if we invite reparations in, and if we invite a sort of equalizing of power between these places. What does that equalizing of power look like? So I got nothing but questions, but I think that this is to celebrate the complexity that folk are bringing up in the chat, but also that your paper invites us to wade through.
Thanks a lot, Raj. And we've got just under 13 minutes. We've already addressed a couple of questions from the chat, one from Leandro and one from Pedro. I'm going to ask the questions posed by Nadine and by Pedro Silva, and I might add a final one. And with the last 5 minutes each of you have, you can decide which bits you respond to. So Nadine asks, how do advancements in AI and their enormous metabolic demands materialize in South-based data centers further complicate the pursuit of ecological sovereignty? And Pedro Silva has a very long question, or a couple of questions, but I'll ask the last bit of it, which is, do you see emerging movements that present interesting models for socio-ecological transition, movements that, although subsumed by the triad, the state, market, capital, state, nation, capital triad, present experiments that can help understand which the mechanisms, political mechanisms for concretizing ecological sovereignty? And my question, because I think it's one thing that we haven't yet discussed, but Raj did refer to Arrighi and his work with Beverly Silva. One of the things that they say, actually in distinction from other world system theorists like Wallerstein, who thought that the decline of US hegemony might mean the end of the modern world system itself, but they talk about the intensification of social antagonisms in this moment of this latest cycle of accumulation. And yet they do that without necessarily going into the details of the way in which the world of work has been transformed and the massive expansion of precarious informality in the world of work. And I wonder how that particular problem, that is a massive problem, not just socially, but politically, presents a specific challenge for the pursuit of ecological sovereignty. What does ecological sovereignty have to say then about the deconstruction, the substantive deconstruction of the modern world of work? So 5 minutes each to answer those three big questions, or any of them that you choose. Thanks.
No, it's wonderful. I'm going to try to tie it all together. I think Raj got into something that's another sort of like the next step into this. I'm part of a lot of spaces that talk about post-extractivism, but my whole point is that they're not talking about post-extractivism. They're talking about anti-extractivism. Because it's the part of imagining, planning, creating the political tools for this is almost absent from the conversation. Very few people do this. And that's why I like to be in the industrial policy spaces, because they make me work through some of this stuff. And I'll give two examples of things that could work here. I don't think we can live without nickel or lithium. I think we need to reduce the supply of the nickel we can live with. Right? So if I put a cap on things, it requires me to think of recycling technology, design of products in a completely different way. It makes me look at cities and the way that residues are dealt with a completely different perspective. And it makes me look at the women workers who are on the streets collecting recyclables and not even being recognized as green jobs, as proper green jobs that should be formalized, better paid, and political, environmental education of people, but also the very design of the products that make recycling almost impossible. Like when we're talking about plastics, a lot of the plastics don't get recyclable because they're tinted in certain colors that it's not economically viable to recycle them, right? So like Tiny little regulations could change this. I'm not talking about a revolution here. I'm talking about basic rules and norms that could come from the state and say, from now on, you can put something on the market this way. What did China do regarding electric batteries? Batteries, that's your problem, EV makers. If you don't deal with the old batteries, you can't produce new ones. So it's a long-standing process, but that's where you have, a really great example of the state doing a very decent, important thing. You created a problem, you fix it. And then if a company created a problem that they have to fix, now they are more inclined not to create the problem, maybe facilitate their own lives in the process of developing a technology and putting a patent on it, something like that. If you do this through a public pathway, we're actually funding universities, researchers, and you're doing this through public companies, it's even easier to do that. And that's why I fully stand, with, trade unions for energy democracy, the people doing the work on making sure that we have public companies. But we need to make sure that these public companies are not just emulating what the corporations are doing in order to compete with them. The public pathway has to be truly a different pathway. It can't just be because it's public and we're going to redistribute the gains out of it. And when we put a cap on certain types of production, you could say, whoa, but if you put a cap on lithium, and then Chile is going to be losing out on prosperity. For all this lithium, they could export raw or develop at home. But you're also affecting the price of lithium. When you put a cap on things, you make things a little more expensive, where they should be. And it brings us the question on the Brett Gustafson's book on The Price is Wrong, that I find quite interesting. The problem with renewables is not they were not cheap enough, is that fossil fuels too profitable. That's the main question here. So perhaps if we're going to avoid a sacrifice zone, you should actually make things more expensive. Give them the proper cost. Isn't that like a lot of the stuff on like Jason W. Moore's conversation on cheap nature, right? And I think it's a great, important concept that people need to read more about, because it's too cheap, it's too easy, it's not costly enough for you to extract things, to bring an impact on things. Make them more expensive, put a cap on it, then the countries that, in the global south that could benefit will still benefit without having to extract all of it. That could be an approach to it that I think could be important for post-extractivism, and that would deal with Nadine's question on AI, right? If we're talking about, data centers, and it's just like infinite territory for data centers and infinite metals for data centers, then you can just say that AI can keep expanding forever too. If you put a cap on how much material is available for things, then maybe people might think that I don't want this for, a new TikTok data center. So maybe TikTok should run for this hour of the day to this hour of the day in this country.
Sabrina, I'm going to interrupt you so that I'm sorry, so that we can get to Raj for his 5 minutes. I'm not sure whether this platform will self-destruct when we get to zero. So
I don't think it will, but
okay, well,
can I just mention one more thing?
Go on.
One more example. Yeah. And regarding like the legal stuff, Fadel Kaboub has a brilliant report on the debtors club, where global south countries that are heavily indebted would work together for a reparation scheme to have technological transfer, and that would help to compensate for their external debt. So I think that's another approach to sovereignty through legal frameworks that could be useful. And regarding the conversation, like giving an example, I think it helps with Pedro in terms of the question that he had here, but also always go back to what Raj was saying. If we go back to some of the stuff that the food movements are doing, there are a lot of things in practice already on how to, improve livelihoods without just copying agribusiness. It's really about producing in a different capacity. And I think there's a lot to be learned. That's why you say like it's easier with the food pathways than with the mineral pathways, perhaps. And that's why the mineral pathways should learn from the food pathways a little bit more.
Thank you. Raj.
Thanks, Sabrina. I just want to end with, first of all, gratitude for all y'all for sticking out to the end. And also for that, I'm really excited to see that report, Sabrina, on debt. I think that if we could include it in the show notes, as it were, that'd be terrific. To think, Juliana, through your question around informalization, I mean, I think that this gets to precisely the sort of inflection point that we're at. I spend a lot of time working with Abahlali Basemjondolo, which is the shack dwellers movement in South Africa. And here's a movement where the formal employment rate is sky high. The formal unemployment rate is sky high in South Africa. And the ways that the shack dweller communities are surviving is through a great deal of informal work, and also the embrace of the fact that a lot of surviving the climate crisis is care work, and it's gendered, and it is precisely the kinds of zero carbon or low carbon work that is precisely what we need actually to be embracing as we make this transition, as Sabrina mentioned. I think that there's a great deal to learn from there. There's also a great deal of danger because in other unorganized informal settlements and in other shack communities, xenophobia is on the rise, and you have these black Nazis in South Africa who are the vilest kind of expression of a certain kind of xenophobia that one can see in informal and shack dweller communities elsewhere. So here's a point of danger that, Juliana, you put your finger on with the sort of precise political contour of the new world of work is radically uncertain, and it needs to be organized. And something, you have the MTSD, you have Abahlali, you have a range of organizations doing great stuff, and you have the far right organized in exactly the same terrain, coming up with radically different and divergent futures. The other thing about AI, I'm sanguine about the possibilities of organizing around it. I mean, if there's one thing that everyone in America hates at the moment, it's data centers. And as the bubble will burst, and probably by the end of the year, the sort of terrain of a deflating economy is historically, again, a very dangerous place, but it's also a place in which we might be able to find more room to think through what the state is for and how it is that we organize here. And as we head towards this recession, I think we would do well to both read everything that the Alameda Institute produces, but particularly to learn from Sabrina's paper here, as we to fortify ourselves to thinking about what it is we need to lay on the ground, what lessons we need to learn from other movements, so that we meet this moment and the depression that's coming as a result of AI with the political clarity that we need.
Fabulously concise, Raj. Thank you very much. And thanks for all your very rich contributions to this discussion. Sabrina, thanks for your presentation and your contributions. And thanks for this great paper, which I also really recommend everybody to read. Thanks for those who have tuned in and posed questions. Look out for the next working papers that are coming and the next seminar, which will be held 1 month from now, more or less, and will be focused on questions of digital sovereignty. Until then, please do check out Alameda's website and our social media for all the activity that we're engaging in, and check out the work of Raj and Sabrina. Thank you very much.